Okay, so here we begin Cratylus. This is another Platonic dialogue. This dialogue focuses on the meaning of words, the etymology of words. And so, from a first glance here, it looks like this conversation takes place between Socrates, Hermogenes, and Cratylus. So Hermogenes and Cratylus are having a conversation, and they invite Socrates into it. And Hermogenes begins saying, Cratylus says, Socrates, that there is a correctness of name for each thing, one that belongs to it by nature. A thing's nature isn't whatever people agree to call it, some bit of their native language that applies to it. But there is a natural correctness of names, which is the same for everyone, Greek or foreigner. So I ask him whether his own name is truly Cratylus. He agrees that it is. What about Socrates? I say. His name is Socrates, he says. Does this also hold for everyone else? Is the name we call him his name? It certainly doesn't hold for you, Cratylus says. Your name isn't Hermogenes, not even if everyone calls you by it. Eagerly, I ask him to tell me what he means. He responds sarcastically and makes nothing clear. He pretends to possess some private knowledge which would force me to agree with him and say the very things about names that he says himself, were he to express it in plain terms. So if you can somehow interpret Cratylus' oracular utterances, I'd gladly listen to him. Though I'd really rather find out what you yourself have to say about the correctest of names, if that is all right with you. So, just as we begin here, it's an interesting start. We have the first philosophical point that is proposed by Cratylus. And he says that the name for each thing is given to each thing because of its own nature. Or explicitly, that there is correctness of name for each thing, one that belongs to it by nature. It is not whatever people agree to call it. And so I think it deserves some reflection in what exactly would it mean for something to be given a name for its own nature. More importantly, though, what would it mean for, what does it mean for something to have a nature of its own? What is this nature that we are talking about? Now, just to riff on this for a few minutes, if we say something that has a nature, in this context it seems to imply that there is something fundamental about the thing in question, the object in question, that would give it a particular sound, a particular pattern of language, and that particular pattern of language would be constructed in such a way that would represent the fundamental characteristics of that object, or the nature of that object. Now, this would presuppose that the language that we use is made and designed for just this very thing in mind, that the very words that we use are so fundamental, that they mean things so grounded in the natural sense, that it's easy to apply a word, a name, and we could say that a name is a subset of a word, that accurately holds the fundamental qualities of the object. And so if I was to think about the word coin, in some sense the term is broad. It's broad, it varies depending on the individual, it varies depending on the culture. When I say coin, some people may think of a quarter, some people may think of a nickel, some people may think of a dime. Some people may not even think of an American currency. Some people may think of different types of coins. Some people may think of a different use for that word, although it's unlikely given the context. If I say think of the object coin, people will probably think of money of some sort. Most people would think of a spherical or a circular object that is made up of some type of metal, and it has some monetary value. So the word coin itself, although not often explicitly, the meaning of which is not often explicitly stated because it's not necessary, it contains a lot of information packed into the word. There are other words that we can use to further specify what the coin is, because like I said, there are many things for which the word coin does not hold within it. It doesn't differentiate between the different types of coins, but it is a word that unifies, in a general sense, what the coin is. Now, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, I think we should do Cratylus justice, and not to move into further possibilities of what the name coin could be, and the reason why we use the word coin to describe coin. Now, Cratylus says, again, that a thing is named because of its nature, because of the fundamental characteristics of it. Now, if this was truly the case, well, I could say two things here. I could say that if this was truly the case in the case of our language, and we use the example of coin, there are fundamental characteristics that are left out of the word coin, because it doesn't imply silver, doesn't necessarily imply bronze, doesn't imply iron. It's likely that a coin is made out of silver and perhaps copper. But there are many things about a coin that could be, many different types of coins that could be made out of different materials. Even through the course of our own country, coins have been made out of different materials. I think even between the coins, the quarter, for example, is made out of two metals. The penny, I think, is more of a uniform coin out of one metal. I think the dime and nickel are similar. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure there are differences in terms of their material composition. And if we really wanted to understand what the nature of the coin was, how would we do so? Well, we would have to go through different fundamental qualities of the coin. Or what we would do is find a word that unifies enough of the fundamental characteristics of the object, then it could account for the variation between the objects of a similar type, which I think coin does quite well. But let's say, and then I would say, as a further addendum to that, that the coin would have subsets to it. So a quarter would be a subset of a coin, because it is a coin, but a coin is not just a quarter. And then this gets into the Platonic opposites argument. It gets into the forms argument. It gets into the prior dialogue, Phaedo, about the structure of reality, this sort of undulating, repeating structure of heaven and earth uniting at a certain point, about the material and the more top-down intelligibility side of things, giving meaning to our material existence, and how exactly we do so, I think is characteristic of our experience of the human mind, of the way that the mind is able to see its reality. Perhaps it's not the only way to see reality. In fact, I think it's likely that it's not the only way to see reality. I'm fairly certain that it's not the only way, because there are many things that we cannot see with our experience with our own senses that are present in the environment. And certainly much of our experience from a more of a elevated divine standpoint has been to determine exactly what the good, the beautiful, and the just are, what it means to be a righteous person or a pious person. These things are not readily measurable. We attribute them to a divine source. But all the while, we are these mortal beings that sort of wallow in their own finitude and have difficulty accurately mapping their soul onto the divine being. And so all of this, I think, is related to our language and how we speak of things. Because how we speak of things, how we make sense of things, is how we make sense of reality. It's how we give light to this world that we are thrown into. And so to get back to the coin, the quarter is a subset of the coin. If I say quarter, many people understand what that means. Okay, there are a few different ways that one can interpret that, but if it's in the context of the coin, people will envision in their minds an object of a similar size, a similar circumference, perhaps a similar pattern. Many quarters these days are state specific, so you can have one quarter be different than another in terms of its imagery, but the eagle on the back remains relatively the same. The dates are different. The relative composition of metals is similar. And so it's enough to unify the mind on a pretty specific object. And that's without even getting into its specific material makeup. Right? We can objectify and measure, quantify the physical makeup of the quarter all day long, but it's not necessarily to unify the minds of man together on that object. And so I think, from what I get here, is that I may not agree with Cratylus, but I do agree that he's onto something. That there has to be, I may get ahead of myself here into what Hermogenes has to say, or what Socrates has to say, but there's a social component to it, because coin, and the language that we use in our mouths, it's relatively arbitrary compared to the physical structure of an object, unless we can somehow determine the vibration of the object and turn that into some sound that we could use that represents the vibration of the object. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that we don't do that. But our language is such that it involves a sufficient memory to recall different characteristics into mind, and these characteristics sort of converge onto a point. Now, some words can be broader than others. Their convergence would be at different levels. This is the point that I brought up earlier about the previous dialogue, Phaedo, of this intersecting between heaven and earth that appears at different levels within what Socrates calls the hollows of the earth. Certain realms of existence have more clarity than others, and all throughout the particular realm of existence there are levels that one can achieve in terms of enlightenment and understanding these different levels, and and the intelligibility of reality. So, I mean, the coin and the quarter is a good example, because the coin as a word is less unifying, but it's still unifying enough for us to understand certain characteristics. When we say quarter, it is a coin, but it's even more specific and more unifying. And so there's a bit of the, like I said, there's a bit of the social component, and there's also a bit of the actual object nature characteristics that we combine together to produce something that is intelligible for us, so that we can communicate with one another and understand one another. So at this point, Socrates picks up the conversation after Hermogenes' response, and he says, Hermogenes, son of Hipponicus, there is an ancient proverb that, quote, fine things are very difficult, end quote, to know about. And it certainly isn't easy to get to know about names. To be sure, if I had attended Prodicus' 50 drachma lecture course, which he himself advertises as an exhaustive treatment of the topic, there'd be nothing to prevent you from learning the precise truth about the correctness of names straight away. But as I've only heard the 1 drachma course, I don't know the truth about it. Sort of a joke there by Socrates. Nonetheless, I'm ready to investigate it along with you, Cratylus. With you and Cratylus. As for his denying that your name is Hermogenes, I suspect he's making fun of you. Perhaps he thinks that you want to make money, but fail every time you try. In any case, as I was saying, it's difficult to know about these matters, so we'll have to conduct a joint investigation to see who is right, you or Cratylus. Hermogenes says, Well, Socrates, I have often talked with Cratylus, and with lots of other people for that matter, and no one is able to persuade me that the correctness of names is determined by anything else besides convention and agreement. I believe that any name you give a thing is its correct name. If you change its name and give it another, the new one is as correct as the old. For example, when we give names to our domestic slaves, the new ones are as correct as the old. No name belongs to a particular thing by nature, but only because of the rules and usage of those who establish the usage and call it by that name. However, if I am wrong about this, I'm ready to listen not just to Cratylus, but to anyone, and to learn from him too. So here we have the introduction of Hermogenes' argument. And the first major statement is that when he says, and no one is able to persuade me that the correctness of names is determined by anything besides convention and agreement. So this is the first thing that we will talk about. I've already mentioned this to a certain extent. The social component that has to do with naming of objects. His argument in the beginning here is primarily that the correctness of names is determined by convention and agreement. And we've already discussed why this is essentially true. Because, well, how would it be that we truly understand the nature of something and then translate that into sound and use that sound in language and attribute that to every object? And not just material objects. It has to do with the entire spectrum of reality. Because, if we begin with the coin example, we can start with the metal. Let's just say silver. We can move to quarter. We can move to coin. We can move to money. We can move to value. All of these things are related within the thread of coin. But you see that there are layers to this. At the very bottom, we have silver. It has an atomic structure to it. It is an element. It is very fundamental. We can go even farther down than that, but it's not necessary to understand the point of this argument. The point is that there is the fundamental material piece, and then we move up in the opposite direction, almost as if it's narrowing and getting wider and wider until we hit money, or perhaps until we hit coins. It depends on where you want to. We can have an argument about the broadness of the terms there. And then, in my opinion, I think it starts to narrow down again when we get towards the top down rather than the bottom up. The bottom up would begin at silver, but the top down would begin at value. And I'm sure that there is more finite places that you can go than just sort of the value, because it's value, then it's money. Money certainly is a broader thing, but its fundamental purpose, in some sense, is to be the store of value. And so anyways, it's best not to get too sidetracked with the analogy. But I think we can imagine in our minds the relative structure that is forming due to this flow of words. And the main point that I want to make is that it is from material to top down. It is from emergent to eminence. It could also be from emanatory to the emergent. Now, this is not Hermogenes' argument. He's saying a part of this. He's saying that there is this social construction. Again, we've talked about the social construction. He says, I believe that any name you give a thing is its correct name. If you change its name and give it another, the new one will be as correct as the old. And I don't think that that is necessarily correct. Because if you change a name, then you break that social contract, that social unified understanding that he just mentioned. It would take some time for it to readjust to the new name of things, but it would not hold the same meaning for some time. No name belongs to a particular thing by nature, but only because of the rules and usage of those who establish the usage and call it by that name. So I think that's partially true. It's not entirely true, because eventually our language has to be tethered to reality. So while we may use arbitrary sounds to describe that reality, we do need consistent and socially agreed upon terms that describe the emergent aspects of our reality and the emanatory aspects of our reality. Now he mentions nature. Now it's a very interesting term because on one hand, nature can be just the material nature. On another hand, it could be its fundamental characteristics, which would include the divine nature and that realm of reality. Because the divine nature, the emanatory, is just as fundamental as the material. That of value, that of meaning and of purpose, this sort of thing is very fundamental. This sort of thing precedes the material in terms of the mind of man, because man needs a purpose. He could just be hungry, but he needs a purpose. He acts for some reason. And the more sophisticated the mind is, the more sophisticated the action, the more sophisticated the manipulation of material reality. Socrates continues, Perhaps you are onto something, Hermogenes. Let's see. Are you saying that whatever anyone decides to call a particular thing is its name? Hermogenes says, I am. Socrates says, whether it is a private individual or a community that does so. Hermogenes says yes. What about this? Socrates says. Suppose I call one of the things that are, for instance, the one we now call man. Suppose I give that the name horse, and give the one we now call horse the name man. Will the same thing have the public name man, but the private name horse? Is that what you mean? Hermogenes says yes. So this is sort of already what we mentioned. There's a bit of a confusion in terms of on the scale of the community, but at the level of the individual, there is an understanding. There is a certainty there. Because they know about the change in meaning. So whatever each person says is the name for something, name of something. For him, that is its name. Hermogenes says yes. And however many names someone says there are for each thing, it will really have that number at whatever time he says it. Hermogenes says yes. And however many names someone says there are for each thing, it will really have that number at whatever time he says it. Hermogenes says yes, Socrates, for I can't conceive of any other way in which names could be correct. I call a thing by the name I gave it. You call it by the different name you gave it. In the same way, I see that different communities have different names for the same things. Greeks differing from other Greeks, and Greeks from foreigners. Now, I think that this is a fundamental argument. I think it's so fundamental, in fact, that it gets into some of the contemporary issues that we face today. I think many of the contemporary issues that we face today. From the sort of the woke culture, the transgenderism, homosexuality, I think, is an example, all the way to the war in Ukraine and our financial crisis. It has to do with the self and its own interpretation of reality. We can call this the excesses of the liberalization of the self. So what exactly do I mean by that? So let's stick with this argument. So when Socrates says, when he proposes the question to Hermogenes, so whatever each person says is the name of something, for him, that is its name. And he says, and however many names someone says there are for each thing, it will really have that number at whatever time he says it. Of course, Hermogenes agrees on this at this point. But I would like to say that, again, this is a very deep question here. It's easy to conceptualize this at the extremes. So if we imagine on one end is self-centered meaning, okay? And on the other end, I'm not exactly sure what would be on the other end, perhaps no meaning. I suppose there's different ends that you can compare this to, but let's start there. So let's start at the self-centered meaning, at the sort of the extreme end, that everybody makes their own meaning for words. So what does this mean? Well, if we imagine a group of individuals that are scattered sort of in the environment, and they all have their own language. They all have their own meaning for things. I think the astute, can clearly see where we are going. We were headed straight for the Tower of Babel. The other selves within the environment will not understand the self, let's say, of the individual. If we can sort of imagine ourselves as the sort of the actor in this drama, I am the person that decides what the name of things are. Now I encounter another person, and they decide their own name for things. Now, we can still communicate to a certain degree. We can get across what we want from each other. We will, just as people of two different languages can get along and communicate somewhat. But their communication would be severely hindered. And the types of connections, the type of bonds, the type of social cohesion that they can have is much reduced. They can't get into the finer conversations. They can perhaps establish the basics. Perhaps they can draw themselves images. to show what they want. But that's going beyond the analogy. If it was just and only the ability to use language, we'd be severely limited. And you would not have a functioning society if it was all just language-based individualism. Forget about all the other modes of communication, whether it be illustration, demonstration, expression, facial expression, acting, and this sort of thing. Just focus on the verbal. If it was all that, and it was pure, unconstrained liberation of the self to find the meaning and to use their capacity to vocalize, to assign things their own sounds, there would be no society. There would be no collective. And it would quickly, I think, devolve into... It wouldn't quite devolve into something that is into something that is meaningless, because it would have plenty of meaning for the people that operate within it. But between the individuals, there would be none. Now, on the other hand, we have the socially agreed upon meaning. That is, there is a center around which the self revolves. Now, in any society, just as Hermogenes had mentioned, the Greeks differ from other Greeks, and the Greeks differ from foreigners. Different communities have different names for the same things. That can exist, but it can only exist as long as there is a stable center. This has to do with the remainder, the problem of the remainder. Now, homosexuality, transsexuality, I think, represent this problem quite well. Because if our center was homosexuality and transsexuality, then obviously, and just like language, our society would not operate at all. And there are many different reasons why that is, but that would be getting a bit too far out into the weeds. To focus on the language here, certainly it can exist that... Let's start with the example of the foreigner and the Greek. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that we have two different words to represent these communities. The foreigner, we can say that the foreigner is our most adjacent. So let's say an American and a Mexican, for example. It could be any foreigner. In this case, the foreigner is the foreigner because there is a boundary between the American and the Mexican, or more broadly, just sort of the Greek and the foreigner, which is just any individual outside of their lands. Now, certain foreigners would be more permeable and able to enter into a dialogue with the Greeks, let's say. But if we are just to focus on language, Spanish, things are changing in the United States. More Americans speak Spanish than they had in the past. But still, there would be some limitation. If one only spoke Spanish and one only spoke English, there would be difficulty in communicating. Now, there are more than just the communication reasons why there is a boundary between these two places. And part of it has to do with the emanatory capacity, the more refined way in which we use our language, and the meaning that comes from that emanatory capacity. And that has to do with the things of value. Remember the analogy that we gave before of the coin. The silver to the quarter, to the coin, to the money, to value, to whatever, right? However far you want to stretch that. In the same way, the division, the boundary, is placed between two locations. Because these societies revolve around its own center. Now, the center is relatively complex, but again, we're just focusing on language. So, just focusing on language. We have two different societies that speak two different languages. The boundary is between them because they speak two different languages. If they spoke the same language, you might still have the same boundary, but it would not be because of that language barrier. And the reason that is because of the self-centered meaning, in a sense. But it's in this sense, it's higher level, because it has to do with the collective of individuals that agree upon its own center, rather than one individual agreeing upon his own center. So in this case, again, a collective of individuals agree upon their own center linguistically, and another group of individuals agree on their own linguistic center, and so they revolve around it, and they have this communal understanding of words. Within their own communities, there will be variation. Within the United States, we have the same words that can mean different things. We really don't need many examples to prove this. We could just sort of take this as a constant of our cultures and our societies, that this is a phenomena that exists. But again, this phenomena is equivalent to the problem of the remainder. Now, the problem of the remainder really isn't a problem as long as the remainder doesn't become the center. Because if the remainder becomes the center, then it is not unifying. There's too much fuzziness in it. There's too much distortion. There's not enough clarity. There's not enough of a union to bind us together. And I think it deserves mentioning here that not only Greek philosophy but also Christian philosophy is much towards discovering what this unity is, not in terms of language, but in terms of being and of existence. And that's a much more a broader category, but it scales at that level. But it's easy to see when we think of something like language in this example. Socrates says, "Let's see, Hermogenes, whether the same also seems to you to hold of the things that are. Is the being or essence of each of them something private for each person, as Protagoras tells us? He says that man is the measure of all things, and that things are to me as they appear to me, and are to you as they appear to you. Do you agree? Or do you believe that things have some fixed being or essence of their own?" Hermogenes says, "There have been times, Socrates, when I have been so puzzled that I have been driven to take refuge in Protagoras' doctrine, even though I don't believe it at all." Socrates says, "Why is that? Have you actually been driven to believe that there is no such thing as a bad man?" Hermogenes says, "No, by God, I haven't. Indeed, I've often found myself believing that there are very bad ones, and plenty of them." Socrates, "What? Have you never believed that there are any who are very good?" Hermogenes says, "Not many." "But you did believe that there were some good ones." "I did." "And what do you hold about such people? Or is it this, the very good are very wise, while the very bad are very foolish?" "Yes, that is what I believe." Socrates, "But if Protagoras is telling the truth, if it is the truth that things are for each person as he believes them to be, how is it possible for one person to be wise and another foolish?" Hermogenes says, "It isn't possible." "You strongly believe, it seems to me, that if wisdom exists, and foolishness likewise, then Protagoras cannot be telling the truth. After all, if what each person believes to be true is true for him, no one can truly be wiser than anyone else. That's right. But you also reject Euthydemus' doctrine that everything always has every attribute simultaneously. For if virtue and vice always belong to everything simultaneously, it follows once again that it is impossible for some people to be good and others to be bad. And so here we have another example of the unrestrained self. And that is to say, when we talk about, as Socrates says, you strongly believe, it seems to me, that if wisdom exists, and foolishness likewise, then Protagoras cannot be telling the truth. After all, if what each person believes to be true is true for him, no one can truly be wiser than anyone else. Now this is the case because there is a certain level of deception that exists within the self, that is possible within the self. Now it very well may be true that if an individual believes them to be wise, they may be wise. But without the standard that is free from the constraint of the self, then again everything becomes self-centered. But if we have some agreed upon understanding, or even measured understanding of what the wise is and how to achieve wisdom, then everybody can sort of move in that direction and meet that standard. Now there may be individuals that increase the bar for everybody else, and that's perfectly okay. And that is certainly an experiential phenomenon. Nor, I should say, does the possibility of self-deception prevent an individual from accurately self-assessing. But if we say that if a person believes that truth is what is true to him, and perhaps what is true to him may not be true to another, then again we run into the problem of the misplaced center, for there is nothing for us to bind us together. There's nothing to bind the mind to the form of wisdom. Because in some sense, it is not secure, is not freed of the possibility of introducing its opposite into the form of wisdom itself. A wise person may think themselves wise, but at the same time not be wise at all. And of course, you cannot truly be wise if you feel that you are wise but are not. Now the second claim here, Socrates is sort of breaking down Hermogenes' argument. So we have gone through the self-centered argument. Now this is something that we've already proposed, but Socrates is now expressing it. The second thing he says, that everything always has every attribute simultaneously. For if virtue and vice always belong to everything simultaneously, it follows once again that it is impossible for someone to be good and others to be bad. Again, it's a problem of the center. It is a problem of possibly introducing an opposite into itself, of course, which is it's not possible for it to exist. and the binding component for which the center provides us. Now Hermogenes says that that is true, and Socrates says, but if neither is right, if it isn't the case that everything always has every attribute simultaneously, or that each thing has a being or essence privately for each person, then it is clear that things have some fixed being or essence of their own. They are not in relation to us, and are not made to fluctuate by how they appear to us. They are, by themselves, in relation to their own being or essence, which is theirs by nature. Okay, so we took a little bit of a detour, it seems, on the nature argument of Cratylus. We took a detour on the argument of Hermogenes, for which we explored the nature of things in relation to the self. But now we are sort of returning to the nature of things. That each thing has some quality, has some makeup, has some distinguishing factors that are specific to it, that separates it from other objects. And again, this is something that we have already discussed in detail. Recall the example of differing countries with people of different languages. I think that this would be a good example of that. Because here we have a boundary. We have a boundary for a specific purpose, the makeup of the people within them, the center that the individuals revolve around. Now, the human societies are a bit different than solitary objects, like the quarter, for example. But we have discussed that there are things about the quarter that are characteristic to it. There are things about the quarter that are more identifiable than if we just said coin. Now the quarter shares many characteristics of the coin, but there are more fundamental characteristics to that of the quarter. And we could break that down even farther. We could talk about its metals and so forth and so on, as we've discussed. Hermogenes says, I agree, Socrates. Socrates says, and if things are of such a nature, doesn't the same hold of actions performed in relation to them? Or aren't actions included in some one class of the things that are? Okay. So there's a lot more, I think, than that initially meets the eye in these past couple of paragraphs. So let me try to outline what I think that this might mean. So let's take an object for our example. I'll stick with the object that we've been using, the coin. I'll say the quarter. Now Socrates says that each thing has a being or essence of itself, to itself, that is independent of the human mind, that is independent of its relation to us. And, as he says, are not made to fluctuate by how they appear to us. And so this quarter, these quarters, has a being and an essence. And I don't think it would be a far stretch to say that being can be equivalent, perhaps softly, but we can say equivalent to soul, essence to spirit. And so if we think of it in this way, of a quarter having a soul, and of a quarter having a spirit. I think it's an interesting way to conceive of these things, because we don't think of physical objects outside of the human being as having a spirit or having a soul. But as a matter of distinction and characterization, of course a quarter would have a soul, and of course it would have a spirit. The soul being the thing that might be a bit different in its nature, we could say, than the human soul, but a soul nonetheless. Now I think this gets into a rather complex discussion, one that circles back into itself often, but I do believe that there is a way out of the paradox. Now what is this paradox? Well, I have chosen to describe this quarter as having a soul and having a spirit. So if we begin by talking about the soul of this quarter, I think we can say, or perhaps I should lead by saying, that Socrates says that they are, by themselves, in relation to their own being or essence, which is theirs by nature. So their spirit and their soul is theirs by nature. So then what is nature? What is by nature? What would we consider the fundamental nature of an object? We can say that the nature of an object is its inherent qualities. We could say that it is a set of defining traits. We could say that it is, of the set of defining traits, perhaps one element in this set would be its behavior or its function. Another in this set could be its physical composition. And possibly the last one in the set would be the intelligibility given to it by the human mind. To give credit to the lens through which all such distinctions are seen through. And so we have three fundamental things here. We have the mental projection of the human being that can determine the nature of the object. And this is done so by considering a set of defined traits. Behavior or function is one. Physical composition is another. And perhaps there are other things that lie within this set, but I think the ones that we have mentioned are fairly comprehensive. And at the very least, they serve the purpose of this explanation. And so, why then would I bring this up? Because we want to determine what the relationship between the soul, the object, the spirit and the object, and nature to the object. Now, what is given to the object by nature, or again by its inherent qualities, this set of defining traits, then becomes what we consider the soul of the object. It is the totality of all of these things. So a side question would be then, would saying by nature, if something, its fundamental qualities, the soul and essence, are given to it by nature, is nature the same thing as its essence or quality, or essence and being? Well, it can't be if it's given by nature. It would mean that nature would possess the being and the essence of the object for it to be given. And the paradox sort of lies then within, well, what is nature? And then again, we define it as a set of traits: behavior or function, physical composition, mental projection. And so nature, in this sense, must be more than the contemporary argument, which is that nature is entirely physical. Now, why do I say this? Because in this example, if nature were entirely physical, it would ignore the human element. What is the human element? It has to do with purpose. It has to do with action. It has to do with the verb to act. To do. To do is in some sense very difficult to describe, as difficult as to be. But to do implies intention. It implies a directed purpose. But then the question is, what is it directed by? Is it directed purely by nature? Surely that's one story that we are told. Is it directed purely by mind? That's another story we are told. We're told both of the human mind and also of the divine mind. And so the choice is, do we believe in free will? Do we believe in nature's laws? Do we believe in a divine being? My answer, for my part, is all of the above. We live in an environment, in a universe that operates under fixed physical laws. But the very fact that this mental projection of this physical reality exists, and the conceptualization that intelligibility itself as a source, we are free to do as we please within this environment and to question our existence, to determine nature, what is its inherent qualities, what is the set of defining traits. We do all of these things for a directed purpose. And so for what purpose? Surely we do things to continue on our race. Surely we do things to satisfy our desires. But is this all of who we are? Are all desires the same? Are we purely in this realm of existence to propagate into the future? That's overly simplistic, I think. The mind can formulate and embody his intention and act it out into the world. It is just as real as the quarter that sits in front of me. And so this quarter has a soul to it. It has its fundamentals. It has its spirit. The thing that, in the absence of the quarter, allows us to tell what a quarter is. Now that's not the best explanation, but I'll return to my example that I used in previous episodes about a fire that is burning leaves in the fall. Now many of us may smell the fire but never see it. And the very fact that we are smelling the fire cues us into its existence. Now the thing about that is that we don't experience the fire fully. Who can say what it really means to experience the fire fully? Surely, more inputs. If we add in vision, we add in the touch sensation, we can feel its heat. Then we are more certain about the nature of this fire and its existence in the physical world. But we can't totally be one with the fire without it consuming us, without our own souls, our own fundamental set of defining traits, yielding to the defining traits of the fire. And so, to return to the example of the quarter, the spirit of the quarter, I think, is what we interact with, mostly. I can feel it. I can observe it. I can look at it under a microscope. I can attribute my mental projection onto the quarter. Some purpose, directed purpose. Of course, not myself, but somebody else has made this quarter for a directed purpose, a common purpose that we all share. It has stored value within it. And given our interaction, socially and with the physical environment to extract the metals from the earth to produce that coin, we have created this object. And we have added a soul to the physical world. Now, can it change? Yes, I think it can change. But I will say that the soul of this object is multifaceted, and just like the fire, which we may also create, we can never really truly embody the soul of the object. We have one embodied existence that is our own experience and our own soul. And so just as the object has a soul and has a spirit, the individual man has a soul and a spirit, different in kind from that of the object. Quite special from that of the quarter. Now, I think part of the difficulty here is running into the paradox of the subject that all of reality is sort of a subjective experience within the mind of man. And then the objective world outside of man. I think we run into this problem because without our sight, there would be no intelligible physical reality unless there is a source of sight itself, unless there is a source of meaningful directed purpose within the universe or outside of it. Now, if there is indeed a source to it, then I think the human being makes complete sense. The mind and its physical structure that allows it to see beyond just its environment, its immediate physical environment, serves as a reflection of the very thing, the very process, the very direction that set all of what we might call these days as objective reality into motion. And we can see this, we know this is true, because there are many by which we can bounce our experiences and experiences of others off of one another. We can collaborate, we can observe, we can measure. All of these pieces fit together to form our reality. It is not one or the other. And just because the human mind is sophisticated enough, and it is the only thing that we know of that is sophisticated enough to see and to do as we do, and to design these grand narratives, whether they be scientific, religious, or otherwise, should not serve as the excuse for misinformation, that the subject is nothing but a falsehood. Because the subject, as I said, is very much a part of this reality, just as much as our objective examination. For to us, if our experience ends, the reality beyond us would not end. But it would not end because there is an infinite source. There is a reason why it exists. It does not exist in nothingness. For we know, as we have discussed in the previous dialogue, that one opposite cannot exist in another. Perhaps I should say that one form cannot be the form of its opposite. It would be an inherent contradiction, an impossibility. I think it may be important before we move on to further the distinction between the soul, what I have been calling thus far the soul of the object, the spirit of the object, and then likewise the soul of man and the spirit of man. I thought it was a good analogy, to at least begin with. I don't think it will hold water down the line, because the differences between the two, between the, let's say, the rock, the sort of the form that is least manipulated by man, because if I say the coin or if I say the quarter, that object is quite endowed with the spirit and the soul of man. And so no doubt it's easier to see, easier to grasp onto the argument that I put forth about the soul and the spirit of the object. While the qualities and the characteristics, I think, of the soul and of the spirit, these sorts of distinctions, I think they can apply to the object. But the meaning between the soul of the object and the soul of man is quite dramatic. It's quite different. And as such, I would hesitate to use the same word between the two things. Now, Socrates had made the argument that the object has this being and essence, and I sort of equated being to the soul and essence to the spirit, and I think it's probably beneficial to renew that language, that the object has a being and has an essence. It gives us an idea, but also the soul and spirit we can leave for man, because they are elevated terms, no doubt. And in using them, I think I have mentioned that they are a rough equivalence. So even if I do use them interchangeably, it'll be implied that when I talk about man, the soul and spirit are different in the sense that they are more elevated than that of the fundamental distinctions, the characteristics, the traits to that of the object. Or I should say the rock, right? Because in some sense the man is an object too. So the rock. So this marks a new day in recording. And sometimes it's difficult to understand exactly where you left off when you're talking about these sorts of things. But regardless of if I have talked about this before or not, I like to continue and discuss the nature of action. Socrates says, and if things are of such a nature, doesn't the same hold for actions performed in relation to them? Or aren't actions included in some one class of things that are? Hermogenes says, of course they are. Now, I think the interesting thing here is that Hermogenes his response is a knee-jerk response to the second question that Socrates proposes. Or aren't actions included in some one class of the things that are? And just like many of us who don't necessarily understand why we believe something, if we are asked a question that challenges our fundamental conceptions, we say, yes, of course. Now, I don't say that to suggest that Hermogenes is wrong by his reply. I think he is right. But I don't necessarily think, from the context of this, and the absence of any further thought on his part to the first question, I don't think Hermogenes fully understands why he agrees with Socrates here. So in that first question, and if things are of such a nature, doesn't the same hold of actions performed in relation to them? Now that's quite the statement, at least in my mind. He's saying, if every object has a being and an essence, then the actions that are then performed in relation to that object, they also have this being and essence tied up with them. And Socrates continues and says, so an action's performance accords with the action's own nature, and not with what we believe. Suppose, for example, that we undertake to cut something. If we make the cut in whatever way we choose, and with whatever tool we choose, we will not succeed in cutting. But if in each case we choose to cut in accord with the nature of cutting and being cut with the natural tool for cutting, we'll succeed and cut correctly. If we try to cut contrary to nature, however, we will be in error and accomplish nothing. And so I think that it's a very interesting discussion. Because in some sense, I think that this is the transjective. This is how I hesitate to say this, but this is how we can see the falsity of the modern frame. We tend to view things from subject to object. We tend to devalue the subject, as I've said before. And you also see it in the Platonic dialogues. You see the recognition that there is inherent danger with the information gathered by the body and incorporated into mind, and what that exactly means for the identity of the self. On one hand, we have, not only back then but today, a recognition that it is possible that the reality that we find ourselves in can be much disturbed and disoriented about the reality that we find within. However, to split these realities into two fundamental, distinct, different places, to such a degree that we alienate them from one another, then I think we have set ourselves up for a great deal of disharmony, disunity, and confusion. We are open to predation by any form of madness that would attempt to fill that void, that split in that reality. And certainly in that time, the mind would hunger for something quite difficult to understand for many. It would hunger for certainty. It would hunger for the truth. It would hunger for its own reality, something that it could tie itself to. And herein lies the danger of our feelings, because we can attach ourselves to a profound feeling. That feeling may be attached to a pattern of reality that leads us astray. But again, it is not the case that we should deny the totality of our reality because of our own weakness and because of our own blindness and because of our own gullibility to be fooled by something that is lesser than the optimal. And so I say all of this to say that when Socrates mentions action, and he moves away from the object, there's an interesting visceral response that I have to it, because now it is in the realm of something that the I part of me can control, the action. Do I not give this action its being and its essence? Am I not in control of this? Do I not have free will? Because there is a difference, it would seem, the things of action and the things of the object. But he's not necessarily talking about the abstract difference between actions and objects. He's talking about actions that are in relation to the object. And he's also not necessarily talking about strict freedom of will. Of course, we have the ability to choose the wrong action in relation to the object that is before us. And depending on what we choose, we will either succeed in our goals. For the example that he gives is to cut. If we choose the wrong tool, fundamentally wrong tool, and choose the wrong action to cut, then what we want to do will not happen. So we have to do in accordance with, we have to choose an action that is in accordance with the nature of the object that is in front of us. And if that reality agrees, we will achieve the goal of our action. And Hermogenes responds to this and he says, "That's my view, at least." Socrates: "So again, if we undertake to burn something, our burning mustn't accord with every belief, but with the correct one. That is to say, with the one that tells us how that thing burns, and is burned naturally, and what the natural tool for burning is." Hermogenes says, "That's right." Socrates: "And the same holds of all other actions." "Certainly. Now isn't speaking or saying one sort of action?" "Yes, it is." Socrates: Then will someone speak correctly if he speaks in whatever way he believes he should speak? Or isn't it rather the case that he will accomplish something and succeed in speaking if he says things in the natural way to say them, in the natural way for them to be said, and with a natural tool for saying them? But if he speaks in any other way, he will be in error and accomplish nothing. Hermogenes says, "I believe so." So what can we make of this paragraph now? Now Socrates has moved from action to speaking. Now speaking is an action, certainly, but is very specific. Speaking implies language. Language implies meaning. So he says again, then will someone speak correctly if he speaks in whatever way he believes he should speak? Now let's break that down. If someone is to speak correctly, in whatever way he believes he should speak, that belief can go astray. The thing that he believes that he is speaking for may be false, and he could spread a falsehood. So, it is rather the case that he will accomplish something and succeed in speaking if he says things in the natural way to say them, in the natural way for them to be said, and with the natural tool for saying them. So the natural way for them to be said is the fundamental one. This is the obvious. It's essentially he's saying, well, you should say things that are true. Okay, well, thanks, Socrates. How do we make that decision? What is the tool that we should use to make that decision? Now again, to go back to this nature, he's saying when in speaking, your speech has a being and an essence to it. Certainly it is reflective of the self. And if it is reflective of the individual, then the individual has a soul and has a spirit. Again, it has a being and has an essence. Now, the individual is an interesting thing, because he can discover exactly what it is about the material reality that is in front of him that he can manipulate. And he can do so to an astonishing degree. But if he forgets that he is manipulating his material reality for some directed purpose, then he will be plagued by inferior forces. Again, this is the type of madness that I was talking about before, between the split between mind and reality. If the mind doesn't properly understand the nature of reality, then the decisions that it will make, and the speech that it produces, and the way in which it alters its material reality will ultimately reflect that understanding. Now, it doesn't mean that because an individual does not have an appropriate view of the nature of reality, which is a very difficult thing to do. I mean, who among us would say that we have the answers to everything? There are certain things that we believe. There are certain things that we say are true because of evidence. But we are, and must always be, humble beings. Now, that doesn't mean to admit defeat in every situation, or to allow ourselves to give us the excuse of willful ignorance because of the complexity that confronts us. But I do think that we can do a considerable amount with understanding certain fundamentals, that there is a source to intelligibility, and we can proceed from there. Because if there's a source to intelligibility, we understand that our existence is not purposeless. If our existence is not purposeless, instead of striving to discover how purposeless we are, we strive to discover our true purpose. And these are two fundamentally different things. It includes a much broader scope of our species. It's a much more exhilarating story. It's a better narrative. Now, having said this, there may be even better narratives out there. But certainly between the two, I think the one that is directed towards the good and has some purpose in mind is the superior one. Now, when he says the natural tool, again, we can go through the fundamentals of this nature thing that we were talking about. We can exhaust the material one, or we could say the tool of the voice box. We can say the process by which the air in the lungs are pushed through the trachea and into the larynx. And in the larynx, the two vocal cords, these things that are made of muscle tissue, they vibrate rapidly, causing sound waves to be produced. The frequency and intensity of the vibrations are regulated by the tension of these vocal cords, which again is controlled by the surrounding muscles. The sound waves then travel through the pharynx, the oral cavity, and the nasal cavity, which serve as resonating chambers that amplify and shape the sound, sort of like the belly of a guitar. The position of the tongue, lips, and jaw also play a role for shaping that sound. The sound waves are produced as speech when they exit the mouth or nose and are detected by the listener. These sounds can be combined into words, phrases, and sentences. It allows us to communicate through language. Great, we have one explanation of that tool Does that tell us why? Does that tell us which tool is the natural tool that we should use? In some sense, yes, because it satisfies a part of nature. But again, it is not the whole of nature. For if it was, it wouldn't matter what the contents of that whole process, from the air in the lungs to the vibrating vocal cords, out through the various resonating chambers and the tongue in the mouth to shape that sound. It would not matter what that content was. All that would matter was that that tool existed. And of course, we can go to Home Depot and pick up a hammer, but if we don't know how to use it, we cannot build a house with it. And so we may have this tool, but the natural tool, and the natural tool in the way that Socrates is mentioning here, is much more elevated than that material explanation. And I think anybody reading this would understand that that is what the context is implying here. And if this person speaks in any other way, he will be in error and accomplish nothing, says Socrates. And so we will return again to this natural tool. We will return again to the conversation of speaking, and of the objects and of the actions, and how all of this is beginning to relate and come through and in on itself, forming this participatory whole that involves the individual as much as it involves the external environment. So we will discuss this next time on the second episode of Cratylus.